Okay guys, we will make a start. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. Just a reminder to make sure that your phones are on silent. And also, I do encourage you to make sure that you don't get distracted too much while listening to these talks. So try to avoid going onto Facebook, etc. I guess today we have 4 lived experience educators that will be sharing their story. These stories, really, they're going to be sharing some of the most intimate parts of their life. So it's just about making sure that we give them the respect that it deserves. It's also important to remember to really listen in and tune in to what the person is saying. I won't release who you're going to be allocated until after the lecture. It's me being a little bit sneaky, so that you have to tune into every person today, okay? However, everybody in this lecture I think they'll have a slight advantage because you'll be able to really see the people in person and pick up on some of those subtle cues that are a little bit harder when you're watching online. And everybody watching online, I think that's probably tuned in at Phoebe there, you'll still do fine, don't worry. Okay, I don't want to... There's not too much inequity there. Some people will have slides. I might introduce a few of the leads as well in different ways. Some people won't have slides. So just to be aware, everybody's going to be telling their story in a different manner, okay? Yeah, and so that's all I have to say. It is a privilege, and I'm really excited to hear the stories today. And so first of all, I'd like to introduce Phoebe Kingston.
All right. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. Hi, I'm Phoebe. I'm here to share my story with you. And for the purposes of this lecture and just for your assessment, I'm not going to be using any fancy storytelling techniques. I'm just going to storytell pretty simply, pretty much in chronological order from the beginning. Depression had always been a really large part of my life, and I had quite a few traumas in my teenage years, and my early to mid-20s was a concoction of highs, lows, and altogether strange experiences which I couldn't quite explain. In England, I'd studied, where I grew up, I'd studied singing, dance, drama at various stage schools, sorry, that's me, and literature and all the creative subjects. And after college, I tried to make it in the music industry. I've been training in opera since 12 years old and wanted to be a pop star. And I also had a keen interest in medicine and the human body. And I got a job as a healthcare assistant in the operating theatres of my local hospital. In 2000, my mother emigrated here to Perth, and in 2002, I followed her here, leaving my father, my friends, and my in-laws behind me, and bringing my then fiancé with me. We've now been together 20 years. Perhaps I thought I could leave all of these traumas behind me in the UK, start a new life here in Australia. I was wrong. The emigration was actually really stressful, and my mother was suffering debilitating emotional distress with a diagnosis of dissociative disorder. I became her carer, and life was generally a lot more stressful here than in the UK. I got a job here in the medical field and grew out of my pop star dreams and focused my attention on my job as a radiology assistant. I was working in X-ray, fluoroscopy and ultrasound and was learning a lot about the human body. One day, after doing something at work, a radiologist said to me, "You're wasted here, you should really be a doctor." And I thought, okay, I'll do that then. And then quit my job, enrolled at college to study what was then the 4-subject TEE, to gain entrance to the UWA Medical School. By the end of 2006, I had achieved a tertiary entrance ranking in the 97th percentile for WA. I'd won several awards at college, including a national one and the valedictorian award. But that wasn't enough. I had to pass the UWA medicine entrance exam, the indomitable UMAT exam. In 2007, I took a gap year after my TE and focused my attention on a UMAT prep course. It was going really well and I was passing all of the trial exams and things were looking good. But just prior to the real exam, unbeknownst to me and everybody around me, I'd actually gone into what you could call mania. To be honest, oh my God, I was probably manic during the entire time at college. So just explaining, in that year, the mania was actually increasing all the way through the year towards the exam. So I ate less, slept less, was working full-time, studying 4 hours a day for my UMAT, all weekends, was running for an hour and a half every day, doing 1,500 stomach crunches every day as well, and I had boundless energy. But my weight dropped down to just 39 kilos, and that was not long after this picture was taken the year before. So due to this mania, I failed section 3 of the UMAT, and I was not offered panel interview, which I was confident I would do quite well in. So when I received that result round about September 2007, things turned sour for me really quickly. To say I was a bit blue would be a gross understatement. I was totally devastated. 3 years of hard work, study, attainments, blood, sweat and tears to fail at my penultimate hurdle. For about 2 weeks, I became really quiet, really withdrawn, isolating myself. I began feeling a bit weird and was hearing noises I couldn't be sure were really there. And then I began to feel like I was floating, sort of floating through my life. It was as if when I said something, did something, drove somewhere, I couldn't remember. It didn't feel like me. My arms and my hands didn't feel like my own. Everything was surreal and strange, and I was a bit disorientated. And then I became irritable, and I had a ferocious row with my mother, and consequently stopped speaking to her, further isolating myself. And my husband and I were living with my mum at the time, so there was a horrid tension in the house. And it was sad, because I'd always been very close to my mother. But something she'd said had angered me, and I'm known for my temper. I seemed completely unable to cope with my failure and the associated feelings. And it wasn't a simple case of resitting the UMAT, by the way. For me, there were some technicalities there, and basically I was out of time. None of the options left available to me had any appeal to me because I was mentally exhausted. I didn't know if I had much left in the tank to chase my dream of being a doctor, a dream that was fast moving away from me. I'm a very determined person, but 3 years of hard study and even attaining awards for it left me doubting if I could ever do any better. Eventually, late one night, I exploded. And I had a ferocious row with my husband, which included me threatening to stab him with a kitchen knife. I drove off into the night and decided to kill myself. Luckily, before I completed suicide, another part of my mind intervened, and I drove home, and the next morning my husband took me to a GP, and that afternoon I was admitted to a psych clinic. Now, at this point, I really didn't know what was happening, right? I was very emotional, confused, and I was angry. I ended up threatening a member of staff and became altogether abusive, violent, and aggressive, and then found myself in Greylands for a week. And then I was being further traumatised on that ward there and was very quickly transferred to a private psychiatric facility. I was on the top of the priority transfer list, so I was lucky I got one of 2 public beds in a very small private clinic. I was hospitalised for about 7 weeks and just didn't know what was going on. Neither did anybody else. Everyone was in shock. I'd been to a total of 3 different facilities and had seen 1 GP and 5 psychiatrists in little more than 7 days. I'd been passed around like baggage and nobody could tell me what was wrong with me. So one minute I was having this fantastic life, wonderful husband and marriage, popular, lots of friends from college, overachieved academically, prospective medical student, I was going to be a doctor. And ironically, my field of interest was psychiatry. And within 3 weeks, I'm doped up, confused, staggering around a psych hospital. And I actually think I said at one point to one of the psychiatrists, I think I'm on the wrong side of the desk here. I was going to be the doctor. Like, people like me do not have breakdowns. Just before discharge, I prearranged to see my chosen permanent psychiatrist and began seeing her every week, and all sorts of different symptoms continued. And for me, that diagnostic process was really lengthy. So it was 10 months before I received my first diagnosis, bipolar disorder. But later that year, in 2008, I was back in hospital with more severe psychosis, and that diagnosis was changed to schizoaffective disorder. And it's remained unchanged since. By the start of 2009, I was actually still in shock at my diagnosis. So it's not an easy thing to hear that you have what's termed a severe and enduring mental disorder. Something that's going to change your life forever, change your future. So by about the February-March 2009 came the second phase, denial. I may have appeared accepting on the outside of my journey, but on the inside there was deep, deep internal denial. This isn't happening to me. I'll get better, I'll prove everybody wrong. For about 5 months, there was a continuation of different symptoms, anxiety, self-harm, some nightmares, paranoia, depression, and then I levelled out a little bit and managed to get myself a wee job in a sandwich bar. And but by getting that job, I was kind of feeding my own denial, because if I can work, then there's no problem, right? And I did okay till the end of that year, and then it happened. I had what's clinically termed a floridly psychotic, paranoid, and delusional episode. I actually believed that the Department of Immigration had armed rogue agents out after me, wanted to shoot me dead. And I went missing from home for a few days. I was wandering beaches, shopping centres, just constantly on the move. I'm on the run, I'm terrified. And I didn't want to go home to my husband in case the agents found me there and shot him too. So I'm trying to deal with this situation myself. I'm independent and I'm very protective of my husband and my loved ones. I began hearing voices too. One was a horrifying voice telling me when to run and when to hide, and eventually I would be shot and killed. And the second voice was like a running commentary on everything that I was thinking, saying, and doing. She is walking very fast. She is smoking a cigarette. She's going into a shop. She is scratching her nose. Both voices, so excruciating. And I felt all alone in this world. And so very, very frightened. At this point, I'd like to ask a quick question. Hands up anyone who's ever lost anything super valuable and expensive. Anyone? Okay. So just hold that thing in your mind for a moment, and I'll tell you what I lost on this 2-day misadventure. I lost my identity, something very hard to get back. Actually lost my identity twice in my story, in 2 senses. First, physically, my appearance, and secondly, my inner self, my sense of self. More on identity later. But I'll explain. So during this current episode that I'm describing, I was leaving a Kmart store and I noticed those, the panels that pick up tags when you leave. So I'm thinking these panels are picking up signals from deep within my hair, beaming them up to a satellite, back down to Department of Immigration, telling them where I'm located. And being located when I get shot, right? So I hurried straight into a hair salon and had them completely shave my head bald to the scalp. So I did a Britney, essentially, is what I did was a Britney. But at this point, I'm really lost without my husband, and I needed him now more than ever. I was sticking by my decision not to contact him, but I so desperately wanted to tell him how much I loved him, and I couldn't. And it was killing me inside, and I felt I would be dead very soon. Eventually, my husband found me, took me back to my psychiatrist, and there was an emergency admission to the clinic for the third time. And this time it hit me hard. I was a very troubled young woman. So then came the next phase, acceptance. At this point in my journey, I fully believed in psychiatric diagnosis, and I conceded. I have schizoaffective disorder. It's true. This is my life now. And I felt that I had to realign all of my thinking, and that process in itself tells us what's deeply wrong with our mental health system, because I'm not offered any alternative frameworks of understanding, right? And I'm not supported in making my own meaning from my experiences. And so I fully accepted my diagnosis, and then came the depression again. While there's not much to look forward to now, I'll probably never really be successful at anything. And once I started this phase, at the same time, I remember waking up in a clinic a few days after my admission and looking in the mirror and seeing this hairless stranger staring back at me. I was horrified, mortified, all of my hair gone. And I just couldn't recognize myself. And because I didn't look like me, I didn't feel like me. Felt vulnerable. I'd never considered myself a vulnerable person before, but I clearly noticed it now. I didn't like the feeling of vulnerability. And going through all that in conjunction with my general acceptance. And I'm a really girly girl, right? So, like, I love hair and makeup and dressing up. So to lose all my hair is pretty devastating. I'd essentially been completely stripped back and had to find a new self-image and identity that give me the confidence to walk around with a shaved head. So this process is really hard for me. And then came the next phase. Lack of insight. You know, it's May 2010 now. It's been 2 years and 8 months since taking unwell, and 1 year and 7 months since diagnosis. And I haven't even typed in schizoaffective disorder into Google. And I knew at this point that, you know, knowledge is power, and what I needed then was power. And so I had to learn. So I spent about 6 weeks with my head in the computer and books, reading dozens of articles and websites and personal accounts, building up what I think is a pretty sound knowledge base, and thinking of things like, you know, prognosis, treatments, trying to cope and trying to plan, and actually thinking that everything I was reading was actually well evidenced and factual and actually valuable and useful to me. You know, silly me was really just medicalizing my personal problems. So back to that term insight, you know, insight, what I'm thinking now, after having done this and done it repeatedly over the last few years, that I don't really like the term lack of insight, because just because the first person doesn't agree with the second person's opinion, personal or professional, that doesn't mean it's the first person who lacks insight, right? It's a subjective thing. So just because I don't behave in this normative way that society expects of me doesn't mean that I'm the one who's sick or the only one who's sick. What we have is a sick society. Perhaps not schizophrenia, perhaps not bipolar, perhaps not schizoaffective. I prefer the term emotionally action-packed. And perhaps I'm just Phoebe Kingston, and my lived experience is a normal and natural part of the human condition. That kind of stuff's probably not ready for this lecture, but I can never help myself from throwing it in there. So anyway, I had been crazy, I'd been shocked, I'd denied, I'd accepted, I'd done all of these things. After my 6 weeks of all this study, I felt quite stable, and I decided to go for a job interview and get back into the working world. And unfortunately, on the way there, I had a horrid car crash, ended up with whiplash, severe whiplash, in a neck brace, diagnosed with PTSD, and I'm back in the clinic for the 4th time. Being me was challenging enough, right? But add in trauma and physical pain, and you've got a whole new ball game. And it was only going to get worse. I was discharged after 2 weeks, but had to return 3 days a week, 3 hours of group therapy in the morning, relaxation class in the afternoon, saw my psychologist every week, saw my psychiatrist regularly, took lots of extra medication, physiotherapy every week, regular appointments with my GP relating to my insurance commission claim, and seeing the insurance commission doctors as well. So by probably October 2010, I was pretty tired. In November 2010, as part of my psychotherapy, I started exposure therapy. And this did not go well for me. Apparently, the feeling of powerlessness that I had relating to the accident brought back memories of my previous sexual trauma history. And I was kind of unable to separate the two events and what was happening in my mind and emotions, and then having a more complex experience of trauma. I had been raped at 14, again at 19, and nearly died. I barely recovered from the first assault and trauma when the second occurred. And so now I'm having another psychotic episode, and I've been admitted back to the clinic for the 5th time. It's now New Year 2011. I've gained 21 kilos on my antipsychotic medication, so just not podgy now, but actually fat and miserable about it. I'd never been overweight before, and this was really hard for me, and I still wasn't recognizing myself. Who was I? In April 2011, my whiplash has finally healed. I've completed 9 months of physiotherapy. And in the 2nd week of June, approaching the anniversary of the car crash, I'm readmitted to the clinic as a precautionary measure, as anniversaries are very difficult for PTSD sufferers. I had done pretty well in my therapies. I'd really tried hard. I'd opened up in all my sessions. I'd talked, I'd whinged about pain, I'd talked, I'd cried, I'd been angry, but I still had a pretty long way to go. And at this point, I'm mentally, physically, and emotionally exhausted. The final blow came in September, when I lost all 3 of my supposed best friends. They dumped me. I was rather unceremoniously dropped, and it was cold. And they no longer wanted to be a part of my life, and clearly I was way too much hard work for them, and clearly they were never true friends to start with. Losing your friends is an intensely painful experience. Essentially, when somebody says to you they don't want to be your friend anymore, your natural reaction, I mean, no matter how they phrase it, right, your natural reaction is to look within yourself. So I'm asking myself, what did I do wrong? Where did this go wrong? Could I have done something differently? And what's wrong with me? Why aren't I good enough? Am I unlovable? I mean, it's hard not to take it personally. It's hugely personal. I now feel deserted, abandoned, and judged. And these scars would take a while to heal. Losing your friends plummets your self-esteem, and then you feel worthless. And then, of course, I've got no friends, I've got no peers, so I'm isolated, right? Fortunately, I've been making some great friends at the clinic, but I wanted many more friends, and I wanted a social life. By late 2011, I had completely lost all identity. I was just entangled in the mental health system, appointment after appointment, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. I'm in my second year now, and it seems like the more therapy I have, the more I lose myself. I had no idea who I was anymore. It's kind of an empty shell. And I had no job, no independence. I was completely dependent on the clinic now. No friends, no peers, no social life. Couldn't really eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't relax, couldn't drive, couldn't work. You know, I'm basically a statistic now, and I was desperate. Who was I, and who was I going to be? And so finally, I tried really, really hard to beat the depression. I picked up a new hobby, I found an interest to engage in, I was reading self-help books and using inspirational CDs, I got a pet from Cat Haven, I did everything, and nothing was lifting the depression. And at this point, I just feel institutionalized, and I feel like I don't really have a lot of options, right? And it was at that point that my psychiatrist suggested electro-convulsive therapy, which scared the hell out of me and my loved ones. And it was going to take a bit of research to make an informed decision. And I did make an informed decision. And I went ahead. I'm going to leave my story there for today. Plenty for you to think about, I'm sure. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Phoebe.
Please don't take offence or be rude. I have to go to a meeting at the Mental Health Commission, so I'm not going to be able to stay and take part. So,
Great.
you know I have to go. So
Yep, no trouble.